Danielle mentioned, my name is Chris Breen. I'm the Chief of Party, for those who don't know USAID parlance, the project manager for the Atlas project, which does climate change adaptation work for USAID. So we have a great panel today, and we'll get to them in just one second. Just a couple other housekeeping things. We'll save your questions for the end. We'll do each of the panels and panelists talks, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. And then one other thing, you'll see these mics down the row here in the room. They're very sensitive. They pick up everyone's voices, and people who are listening in will be able to hear everything pretty much that's said in the room. So if you need to have a conversation, I would suggest going out into the lobby there. Otherwise, it will be heard by all. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. I will introduce each panelist, I think, as before they speak. So I'll do one, and then they'll speak, and I'll do the next one. And we'll go down in this order. So our first speaker is Anna Booker. She's a senior climate change specialist at the climate policy team of the World Bank. She leads several initiatives regarding mainstreaming of adaptation to climate change, climate information, and risk screening and vulnerability assessments. She also leads the development of the World Bank Climate Change Knowledge Portal, an online tool for climate and climate-related data, one that I know on Atlas we use quite extensively, so thank you for that. And so, Anna, why don't you get into it here? No, I think the green lighting is on.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, great, thank you. I'll stand so everybody can see me, and I hope this works. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to join colleagues that we haven't seen in a while, so it's good to reconnect. And to tell you a little bit what we're doing at the World Bank. It's a block away, but it's good that we're doing this for audiences. So I just want to tell you a little bit what we're doing in terms of risk screening and climate change and integration, and mainly the goal is how we're mainstreaming internally the aspects of the commitments of climate change. So all this, the work is not really out in a vacuum, but really it started mainly really deeply after 2016 when we developed a climate change action plan for the entire World Bank. And this plan really guides the work in really four main corporate commitments. So it's really understanding the climate co-benefits, some adaptation and mitigation of each of the activities we do in terms of investments or any of the other activities that World Bank does. The climate disaster risk screening per se of every single activity. So what is the risk in terms of the conceptualization of these actions, and what does it mean in terms of risk to the project, but also risk of the project itself to contribute to climate change risk and vulnerability. We also are performing GHG accounting of every single activity. And now the latest corporate commitment is that how do we integrate in the economic analysis of our projects and development activities the shadow price of carbon, how we start integrating those assessments in your analysis. So all that really is to guide four big pillars. How we, the process of mainstreaming really means how we support the transformational policies, how we guide institutions in the developing countries that we work with, but also how we also modify the way we do the business internally. How we can really bring, and that's the core of the World Bank, really leveraging resources, how we bring the finance actions into some of these commitments as well. How we can really scale up sectoral climate action, so how we work with the countries, but also larger, the global community on climate change, and how we can use some of these elements to scale up the discussions. And then how we also align our process, how we work with partners, how we create partnerships, and how we continue this discussion as a broader aspect. So coming back to the particular topic of the climate risk screening, when this commitment was announced, it actually started in 2014, where we started to develop in partner with other partners here, some tools, because the commitment was out, but then our teams were like, okay, now how do we do this? And so we, as an offering, we started to develop climate screening tools. What they mean is, was an understanding, it's a process. So the tools really became a process how to understand what is climate risk and really have that process internalized in terms of understanding exposure to climate risk, understanding what that exposure would mean in terms of the impact of the project or at the different levels. What does it mean in terms of bringing adaptive capacity and our way to respond to this impact? And then at the end, how this overall component would really mean in terms of risk. And what does it mean when a task team is developing a project? How can we modulate some of those risks? So we have an opportunity to change and bring an outcome in a different procedure. So what you see here is a bit of a set of different tools. We have, just to tell you a little bit about how we do this, these were initially developed for 4 tools, for 4 main sectors. Now we are about 8. And so the process really started as a way to collect the project information, how to build on the sector expertise in the teams that are going to do this analysis, and how to also bring a lot of the development context. Because one thing I forgot to mention is that the way that we are perceiving this climate risk is in addition to all the development concerns and aspects that the task teams have to do and have to deal with in terms of thinking about an investment development project. So what is in addition to everything that I need to take account to in a different, the political and sectoral, socioeconomic aspect, what is the climate change component? So it is considered as a development point that needs to be concerned. So all this information, the screening tools is really provides a way to integrate. And we also, on top of that, we're providing a lot of support through access to climate change trends and projections of the climate information per se. Once we have that, is the way that we can identify risk. This is really remains to be done at the early stages. So it's at the concept note stage that we really promote the use of the tools to the conceptualization, to thinking what can be done from the beginning, and then how we start the dialogue. So what are the things that we need to prioritize in terms of deep analysis? What are the things that we can prioritize and things that could be done in the project itself? Or what are the elements that we can do that we consider either hard infrastructure changes, but it is also one of the soft components of a project. And this is more what we call the adaptive capacity of the project. So there's a lot of these elements of bringing capacity, building early warning systems, anything that you can do that really modifies the ability, but they're kind of like win-win and good practices anyhow to modulate that effect. And then after that, then we consider, okay, this characterization, we move forward in terms of how we can proceed. The new tool, so we've been doing this since 2014 and think that we've had a couple of years to get some sense of impact, how good these tools were or how useful were they. So in terms of a lot of the input that we're receiving, so in the last past year, I have my colleague here, Vivian Clemens, that is more leading this new phase of the tools, we really took into consideration some of the components. And now we are dividing the use of the tools with the teams in 2 ways. One is the rapid screen assessment, and one is the in-depth screen assessment. And we did this because a lot of our teams also spending more than 2 hours in front of a computer. That's too challenging. We mentioned about use of climate data and climate information, and I'm not presenting it here, but a lot of the aspects we bring is into the Climate Change Knowledge Portal, which is a portal quite dense in terms of information and climate data. But how we would use that to really quickly inform them in terms of what does it mean for the sector, it was quite challenging. So this diverse approach really now is allowing us to guide the task teams to do a bit of a sense, okay, these are things that you really need to consider, and then you can go into this in-depth stages. This is just an example of what an output of the screening tools will go, and I only have 10 minutes to really go through, so I don't have a lot of insights on the tools. But it's really those 4 steps that I told you. So it's really how to analyze the exposure. These are the kind of risks that we evaluate. And then this color code will tell a sense of what are the risks in terms of exposure, impact. The adaptive capacity is something that we really emphasize in terms of what are the elements that you, if you do in the project, can actually increase your risk, or what are the actions that you can start decreasing the risk in terms of win-win or self-consolidation. And then all that combined will give a sense of the project's delivery, the outcome, and risk that you need to really embed or go in further steps. So what do we do next? And I think that's a big question after we do the risk screening. It's a lot about understanding what those sense of risk means. So depending, and this is I guess the million answer or the $1 million question, how do you start describing for different teams what high risk compared to no risk means? And so a lot of these things that we are providing is for them to really understand a bit more, what are the climate hazards and the exposures aspects, what are we talking about? How can we help them translate what impact means for water, or for transport, or for energy? We also want to understand what overall risk, and this is the slide of the climate change knowledge forum where we're bringing a lot of this information together. So the idea is that we need to start working on guidance now. So helping the teams, once they go through this information, understand what are the elements that they can work with. So we're developing small guidance notes. This is a bit more internal, but the whole tools are going to be available. They're currently available, and there's a little brochure outside that you can take. But the in-depth, the guidance notes on that, we hope that it will be available later this fall. So we are providing guidance for them. We're also having a lot of training and face-to-face trainings and really understand the process, because there's a lot of thinking how we can mobilize and how we internalize this aspect. So the question is, when do I start doing this, and then how do I start getting support on when I identify the risk, what else to do later? And so there's a lot of a structure that is needed to put this in place in terms not only to provide a meaningful content, but also how do we guide a team. The next phase is really how we position ourselves in the climate change group, that we're now working with every single team, and how we're aligning the screening tools to all the other corporate commitments, because I think that's the best way, or one of the important ways to do it. The risk screening is an entry point to start discussing co-benefits, for example, and how we start aligning some of the options that we could discuss on what to improve the resilience of the project in terms of co-benefits, what can you do in terms of adaptation, what can you do in terms of mitigation, but then have the whole discussion in terms of mainstreaming climate change. So I'm sorry, it was really rushed and a lot of things, but happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of information, as you say, in a short period of time. We'll have time to explore a bit more during the Q&A. So next we have Becky Chaco from USAID. Becky is Senior Climate Change Integration Specialist at USAID. She's been spearheading USAID's efforts to integrate climate change considerations across agency programming since 2013. These efforts include the development and implementation of USAID's climate risk management process, about which Becky will now inform us. So please do.
Thank you.
Now can you hear me? All right. So managing climate risk is something that USAID has been doing for a number of years. But we recently have codified our approach by updating and systematizing some of our approaches. So it was in October of 2015 that we really began to systematically manage climate risk in our strategies. These are mission and regional level, usually 5-year strategies. And then the following October in 2016, we began to assess, address, and adaptively manage climate risk in our policies, projects, and activities, which many of you know as awards and contracts. I want to say we've learned a lot from a lot of other donor organizations and others who are trying to do climate risk management too. And so that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here to share with you guys what we've been up to, but also to learn more from these panelists and from all of you about how we can do a better job at all this. So I'll tell you a little bit about our approach, but just to make it a little more real, I'm going to share a couple of examples first. So in Uganda, we had an education, youth, and child development project that identified high risk to objectives in cases where employable skills were in areas that were affected by climate variability and change. So for example, agriculture, agro-processing, agro-enterprises. So this activity is now integrating climate-smart agriculture and sound natural resource management into youth training programs so that the skills that they learn will still be relevant in a changing climate. In Mozambique, we had a new HIV/AIDS activity that includes multiple innovative measures to address the risk of floods and droughts, to patients' ability to access health systems, health facilities, and also food, which is actually really important for antiretroviral treatment. So the fact that floods and droughts were increasing was really an issue there. So some of the measures that they included include multi-month scripting so that people can still continue to take the prescription medicine without necessarily having to travel long distances to see their doctor if they're not able to get there if there's a flood, for example. It also includes collecting better data to better understand how climate is impacting health and HIV. And they're also doing nutrition training that incorporates addressing drought. And then in Southern Africa, we have a regional energy program, and it is incorporating climate resilience into templates for investment decision making. And so it's going to work with investors to adopt and use those templates so that they can address the impact of climate on energy infrastructure. So this program will build the capacity of regional sector professionals and utility managers for climate resilient resource planning and demand forecasting. Hopefully that also starts to give you a sense of these issues impact a lot of different sectors. But enough of that for now, and I'll just go on to tell you a little bit about how our process works at USAID. So first of all, climate risk management is an iterative process. We apply it at different levels, as I said, policies, strategies, projects, and activities. And this enables us to identify risks early, as Anna was saying, but also to address risks at increasing levels of detail in the places where climate risk is most important. The process consists of assessing, addressing, and adaptively managing climate risk. So that means doing climate risk assessments, incorporating climate risk management measures into our programming, and using monitoring, evaluation, and learning to support adaptive management. To date, we've focused a lot of our energy on building internal capacity and processes, but there are important roles for implementing partners to play, and I know many of you here are implementing partners. You guys are the ones who are actually carrying out USAID work on the ground. And so that means, in some cases, the implementers may be doing climate risk assessments. And whether or not they do, it's certainly important for them to understand climate risk, to be able to implement climate risk management measures, whether those are identified by USAID or by the implementers themselves, and also to adaptively manage for climate risk. So we have guidance and resources, and we hope that they'll be helpful not only within USAID, but also to implementers and to anyone in the development community who's thinking about how to address climate risk. You can find resources such as our climate risk reading and management tool, our CRM, monitoring, evaluation, and learning guide, and country risk and regional risk profiles that summarize existing information on climate risk at that country or regional level. They're all on climatelinks.org, and if you aren't familiar, but I think you might be since you're here, I encourage you to check out climatelinks.org. And then finally, I want to mention our climate integration lead, which is another important way that we provide support internally within USAID. So we have identified climate integration leads for every mission and bureau. Now, the main responsibility for climate risk management lies with those closest to design and implementation. And we really strongly believe that regional and sector experts are best placed to assess and address and adaptively manage climate risks. But the climate integration leads can provide an important support to the rest of the agency. And so they help people to understand the process, to access and understand relevant climate information, which is not always easy to do, and overall just to make the whole process feel a little less overwhelming. And it's really great to have food security people be able to support other food security people, health people support other health people, somebody who's right there in the mission with you, who can support you. So that's been an important part of our process, is disseminating the capacity for this across the agency with the people who are actually doing the programming and also with the climate integration. So we recently conducted a stock taking. We wanted to see how we did in the first year of full implementation of climate risk management at USAID. And we found that climate risk management is being pretty consistently applied. 95% of new programming applied climate risk management. And also that it's actually relevant to a large portion of USAID's portfolio. 78% of projects and activities identified climate risk, and 60% of those identified high and moderate risks. However, we did see that there is still room for improvement, in particular in terms of quality of climate risk assessments and also follow-through, making sure that the results of the climate risk assessments are actually being incorporated into solicitation, into implementation, and into MEL processes and things like that. So we're working on that. We also found that people generally view our resources as useful, but the awareness of both the resources and sometimes the climate risk management itself is incomplete, and particularly with the implementing partner community. So I'm really hoping that you guys can help us to spread the word that climate risk management is an important part of USAID programming. And I'm also, another thing that we're doing is working on refreshing some of our climate link pages, so hopefully it'll be easier to find our resources. And we'll be adding a few new resources, including some e-learning, catching up with the World Bank on that one. And those should be posted in the next few weeks, so keep an eye out. Finally, the stock taking did identify some significant benefits of climate risk management, namely improved sustainability and resource resilience of our investments, reduced risk exposure of our investments, and better program design. There's plenty more to say, but I'll leave it there for now, and look forward to talking to you more in a little bit.
Great, thank you very much, Becky. And I think your examples were particularly powerful. I mean, ones in sectors where one wouldn't necessarily think that you would have climate risks or significant risks, and clearly you can. So applying the process across the portfolio obviously bears fruit. Okay, so next, Mari Carmen Esquivel. Got it. Mari Carmen is the climate change specialist at the IDB, where she focuses on mainstreaming climate change adaptation in the bank's portfolio. Her interests of specialization include integrated disaster and climate change risk management, urban resilience, and environmental policy and planning. With that, let you take it away. Just wait as long as the green light.
Okay. Will you advance to slide 1?
So hello everyone, and thanks so much for inviting us. It's great to be here, also see familiar faces, and also here to learn. This is a new topic, and we have a lot to learn. I'm going to be talking to you about IDB's approach to climate risk at the project level. I don't have a slide. I hope that is how that goes. I hope I can maintain your interest for 10 minutes. I'll focus on these minutes on the framework under which this work is supported by at IDB, the process that has been followed to date for the early identification of risks in projects, lessons learned to date, and the connections with other interventions that create capacity in governments for this work. If you were at IDB in February, we had a little meeting on this, so probably you've heard these statistics before, but I'll present them again because I think they paint a picture of why this is important. I know probably here we're more focused on how, but at least for the Latin American region, for example, 86% of countries in LAC have at least one regulation that defines which are the critical infrastructure in the country. And in most cases, it states that this critical infrastructure needs to follow certain codes and design parameters. And in 65% of countries in the region, there are regulations that ask for a disaster risk analysis in the pre-investment phase. So that's pretty high. So I think it's pretty important why we should look at climate risk. But the how, that's where we need to learn a lot. And particularly for us at this stage at the IDB, how can we look at physical risks of projects in a way that is effective, efficient, and adds value to projects? And finding that sweet spot has been a big driver for us. So before continuing, I want to acknowledge two things. First, that at IDB there are a lot of people working on this that have given a lot of time and dedication and support. We have colleagues from the disaster risk management team, from the environmental and social safeguards unit, and climate change. One of my colleagues, Daniela Zuluaga, is here. She has been instrumental in this process, and she can expand also in the Q&A on this process. And yeah, to emphasize that we are working on this, so we welcome all your feedback as well. So first, the IDB has a disaster risk management policy, which talks about how this approach of looking at risks to projects should be looked at in the project cycle. It talks about existing climate variability and expected climate change in the long term, right? And it says it explicitly, right? Climate change is expected to change some countries' disaster risk, their probable losses by changing the characteristics of the hydromet hazard. So we have a very clear mandate at the IDB for an integrated approach that basically gets reinforced in our annual meeting in Bahamas in 2012. And basically the board there gave the thumbs up for us to screen all relevant projects for climate risk by 2018. And we interpret that as December 2018, so you still have some months to go. So just want to give you that it's an integrated approach. We have liked that, but it makes things a bit harder. So just want to put that out there. Second, like many others, we have a screening system, and to help us classify projects. So screening is done at the very early stages of the project cycle, same as in other MDBs. And the goal is to classify projects in high, moderate, and low risk. High risk and some moderate, depending on the project, will need some further climate analysis. So this screening process has been in place for around 4 years, and of course we continue to improve it. For now, we have layers on hazards that look at the historical and also have climate change, and we have partners in the room that have helped us a lot with that as well. So the current screening, to emphasize again, is based on hazards that is trying to identify if a project is located in an area where there's a threat of flooding, for example, landslides, and where climate scenarios are also included. This is an important first step, and I super want to emphasize that. It has been really important to get to this stage. But it's also important to see what else is needed, and this has been important for us in our process, because the experience of classifying a project based on hazards has some limitations. And I think part of the challenge we have is, right now I'm looking just at what the IDB is doing at the project level, right? So the project level unit of analysis brings some changes, especially for climate change scenarios that have a big resolution. Sometimes we don't know where the project is going to be located when it comes into our project cycle. We don't have the available information on hazards at a low resolution. For example, flood hazard maps have a low resolution compared sometimes to the scale of the project. Let's say, for example, we have multi-works that, we don't know the exact location. We know there's going to be an urban upgrading project, that there's going to be some electricity done, some roads, some urban sanitation, but the exact neighborhoods haven't been decided for board approval, right? So we have to handle those things. A project we like to use as an example is a project in a Caribbean country that in the screening process of hazard was flagged as high risk. But if you look at the project itself, it has climate change mainstreamed in the components. And the project itself was using, some, cards for some farmers, some seeds, things that are very important and need to contemplate climate change, but it's not exactly a high-risk project that needs an expensive assessment. So it's very important for us to find, again, that sweet spot. We've tried to have a system where we really hammer down on what projects need further analysis. So this takes us to a criticality, right? So we've had to complement this hazard-based screening on the characteristics of the project typology. A vulnerability-based screening that sees what projects, due to their own characteristics, are more likely to be affected by disasters. And defining this with the sector. So, for example, one example of this was with dams, right? So, a reservoir or a dam, depending a lot on the height, depending a lot, and of course, there's all these things on water availability as well. So you have some characteristics, especially on the disaster part as well, that will help you a lot to see if this is a dam that you're really worried. Also, if this is for hydroelectricity, how many people are you serving? If this project fails, what is the damage to the community of probably they rely on this project for all their energy. What else? We have continued piloting this in 2018, and we are applying it in the organization portfolio, but we are focusing a lot on infrastructure. So that's why, a lot of what I'm saying to you is basically on the work we've concentrated in water, energy, transport, and some agriculture. And through all this learning, so we're getting down basically to a system that has a screening, that has these hazard layers and the project criticality, a qualitative approach, and until then jumps into a quantitative approach. And I think that is something that we've been learning over time. Of course, there's always things that you give up on that. You want to have a quantitative approach if you want to go to cost-benefit analysis. That's very useful. But sometimes you don't need to do that. And we recommend, even if you go to the quantitative approach, to really have a qualitative moment. Like, don't jump to a quantitative analysis until you know really what is needed. And sometimes we've had an experience of a project that just want to know the return period to use, right? Instead of really asking how my project could fail and what's really going on in this area. Where's the flooding coming down? When is the river a problem? When is the rain a problem? So basically keep it simple with the sector. Gaining that confidence of the sector has been super important for our work. So having a project approach, I would also say that I would reinforce what has been said by my colleagues of that connection with other interventions to build capacity in the country. Because it is not only about risk assessment, right? We also have projects, disaster risk management projects, adaptation projects that are there to build capacity. We've concentrated a lot on the index of governance, right? Because we don't want to focus only on the operations that come to the IDB project cycle. The countries have their own public investment systems as well. So we're starting this dialogue with countries, and the more we can enforce that, the better the projects will come to our pipeline. And of course, we always emphasize that it's not only about risk assessment in our projects. We need to look at the big picture, land use planning, environmental and water management, risk reduction, and the full picture, because that's that package that will really help us in results. So to summarize, there's a clear mandate, an integrated approach, and we're working a lot on the process in connection with other vehicles that banks have. And just to maybe close, also looking at these statistics that I told you at the beginning, and I credit my colleague Sergio Lacambra, a disaster risk management specialist at the bank on this. For example, in LAC, 70% of the countries In 70% of the countries, there's no requirement for contingency plans for critical infrastructure investments. Insurance policies are not required in 53% of the cases. Trust assessment is just the beginning. There's lots of other components of risk management we have to work to tackle these issues. So there's lots to learn, and it's just one piece of all that is needed to do. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Mara Carmen. You did manage to keep our attention despite the lack of time.
Okay. I'm glad.
Thank you. Yeah, and the point about when's the appropriate time to do this risk assessment, you know, you obviously want to do it early, but if you don't necessarily have all the project information, you know, it can be a challenge. So it's that, you know, threading of the needle. And for those who have practiced or know about environmental impact assessment, you know, it's the same issue. You don't want the projects to proceed before they've been assessed, but you need to know enough about the projects so that you can assess them. So it's kind of a conundrum. Anyway, we find a way.
Yes.
Okay. Next up, last but certainly not least, Dave Gibson. Dave is a senior environmental specialist at the IFC's Corporate Risk and Sustainability Department, where he leads support to IFC's investment clients in forestry, wood products, aquaculture, and agribusiness. He currently leads IFC's efforts to use geospatial information systems for risk and analytics. Dave, you have no idea what you're going to say, but go ahead and say it. Who is that?
So I have to use that mic, I guess. It's a good idea. People are remote, you can't hear me. Yeah. Good afternoon. Before 4th of July weekend, some of us have a long weekend. And most of you would rather be someplace else. But, Carlos, I'm going to do something a little bit different from this. I think they build a great context for what we're thinking about trying to do, and a lot of the economic analytics that are being used. But the IFC is a different animal, more or less. Those who don't know the difference between IFC and the World Bank, is we're a member of the bank, but we're really focused entirely on private sector investments in the queue. We really operate more like a commercial bank, a commercial development bank, more than anything else. So I work within the Manufacturing, Agriculture, and Services group, which is our industry group. And I spend most of my time looking hard at investments. At the beginning, appraisal stages, all the way through supervision, which may be 6, 7, 10. I've got one project that's 12 years old now. So this is a continuing conversation, and as Chris just brought out, we don't know all that much at the front end oftentimes, and we only begin to realize where the bridges wash out, where the rainfall is different than what we thought, where things have changed during the 12 years we've been there, where we didn't know enough really to be able to appraise properly. So I'm not the IFC's climate change guru, and we really only have one, Vlado Stenik, and he really is the only person that we have that focuses entirely on looking at climate risk, and he's helping to develop some new tools really focused on particular sectors, ports, harbors, roads. The first one he did was on forestry and pulp and paper. I helped to work with him on it, and it developed a very long model that required so much information that I doubt very few of our clients would actually be able to answer it all in the pulp and paper sector that I work on quite a bit. But the point is that we don't do an awful lot of it, and if I can figure out how to make this thing work, page up.
Hi.
Thanks. Okay. Well, this didn't look at all like it was on my screen. Yeah, isn't that great? Okay, well, if the contextual setting of this is what I'm going to set up. I'm going to bore you with 3 slides on how we're organized to be able to handle risk assessment, which I think is important. We have performance standards, 8 of them. We're on our second go-around. We started in 2007, refreshed in 2012. They include just about everything except climate change, biodiversity, indigenous people, land, water, energy efficiency is about as close as we directly get. A lot of the work we do is focused on efficiency, and it's through that window most often that we look hard at climate risk. And since we're looking at transactional climate risk, we are most often really looking at climate, what do we call it now? It's not change, it's variability, right? And that's really what transactionally, financially makes a difference for us. Will the company continue to operate? You know, what are the risks to business continuity, and what's going to hang us up in the cessation problem? Most of our clients do have insurance. We can't really go and get co-lending with other partners, other banks, other funds and what have you, without insurability. So even our forestry assets and partners have insurance. We'll come back to that. But we've got our 8 standards. We've got 62 industry guidelines that actually provide parameters for measuring efficiency. So in most sectors, we'll explain how many tons per or gigawatts or tons of carbon even we expect to come out per unit of whatever we're doing. But those are benchmarking instruments. They're really not geared for climate change, climate variability measuring. They're really efficiency requirements. So we've done a good job. We've got new EHS guidelines for things like wind power. We just concluded one for perennial and annual crops. And it's got lots of information on tolerances and some specific information on benchmarking. But it's really up to the company in Performance Standard 1, risk management, where we generally pick up the risks into climate. So all of that comes together and it gets put into a nice little handbook, a procedures manual that describes exactly how we as specialists are supposed to do the assessment of these projects. And it's a fairly straightforward process. The project cycle, as I think everybody would imagine, starts out with an early review, a go, no go. It moves into an appraisal. If we get an internal meeting that says, yeah, we think we can handle the risks, and then we get to public disclosure, and we do a lot of public disclosure. And if we don't disclose something, we get in trouble. But up until now, climate is not something we generally do disclose very much about. If it gets picked up, it gets picked up as an inefficiency, or it might get picked up as a client's deficiency in their own assessment. So they may not be assessing properly the risk to flood or hurricanes or fires. A variety of things are quite often related to climate variability. So we pick it up as we go through the supervision cycle, and theoretically this wonderful loop continues to loop, and we all achieve continuous improvement. And the thing that goes on, I bored you with 3 pieces of language. Performance Standard 3 says clients are therefore encouraged to consider their potential contribution to climate change. So that's pretty indirect. It's only in the guidance note where you actually get some specific language that talks about what we're supposed to do. And the performance standard is actually the policy, and the guidance is not. So it's really left up to us to try to figure it out. And we have lots of people that are very, very qualified in chemicals and in aspects of social and environmental industries and regions. I think we've got 125 or 130 people now distributed all over the place. But it's really up to them to interpret this paragraph and identify the risks associated with climate change, particularly for those that fit some of these criteria and underlying extreme weather events, which is what keeps us all awake at night, right? that look like inside the system. Good, I'm glad you can't see that. That's what the back end of the system looks like. There's about 5 or 10 pieces of the back end, and we all have to dutifully fill in the boxes, and it all kind of gets mashed together and creates a template, and then it goes into the investment department, and the investment department, where an awful lot of the real financial risk is determined, depends on a lot of systems that we all know about. You know, what's the S&P, Standard & Poor's. Most financial institutions in the world depend on S&P. And guess what? The S&P really doesn't include climate risk. You know, they take country risk and they take industry risk. They blend them together, mix them up real hard, and throw them in a box and give you a number. And the investment officers then take that number and then they start to play with it with the various other tools and instruments. But ultimately, you're depending on others to have caught that in the front end, and they don't. So this is what we do. We walk through it. We try to get at it. I think we do more often than not get at climate-related risks, but we're not perfect, and we don't really have a strong directive to do so yet. As part of the World Bank Group, we're part of the group, and we're supposed to be doing this. We've been tracking, actually accounting for carbon emissions for 7, 8 years now. And we identify what part of our investments actually may be invested in things that are actually reducing carbon emissions, and we don't report that externally. It's really for our own internal purposes, but it's beginning to guide the way we think about climate in investments. So I think we're going to report something around $1 billion this year. I think that was about the same as last year, in investments that were directly related to improvements in climate risk. So I'll get to that. I see the sign in the back already coming up. So I wanted to get to the interesting stuff, which is really the modeling. What's going on in the world of bringing this stuff directly into us. We're trying to get this at the fingertips of the specialists. We don't have access to weather information. Carlos spent a couple of years in Mozambique. How many operating climate stations are there in Mozambique?
You put me in the spot.
3. 3. So they don't really know much about it. This is a new piece that's come out. This is NOAA. This is part of the GLADIS system, and this is really an amalgamation looking at runoff and stormwater in a particular place for a impact investment client we were working with in T, right in Rwanda. Oh, that's interesting.
Just a 10th grade.
Oh, no, that's great. Oh, I should have known that. This is supposed to be live, by the way. All of these models are actually live. The best way to do this is bring it to life, so we can touch anywhere, and it would, show what you wanted to see. That was a bit of a, sorry about that, I don't know how to bring it back, so we'll just go on to Mexico. I have a fish forest and an agriculture client in this area of Mexico. And we worry about hurricanes, we worry about floods, we worry about tropical storms, because if we notice now, we're getting far more tropical storms than we are hurricanes. And guess what? Tropical storms are generating inside the Gulf. I've been down there twice in the last 3 years, where we don't have to wait until Cape Verde sends us over a hurricane. We're generating hurricanes in the Gulf now. That's new, that's different. So we got clients that are there. Fisheries client is up in the Sierra, and the other two are down on the coastal flats. And access to the roads, to the planting and logging equipment, getting the work crews in and out, keeping villages feet wet, feet dry, is critical. So this kind of information is really, really important. What's the frequency and the type of storm event we're seeing in this part of Mexico? So we're starting to look at these things. Okay. Rwanda, this is not the way it's supposed to show. This impact investor that I started on the other slide, we were helping them try to figure out where they would go to smallholder outgrower schemes. They had a nice, good-sized tea plantation, but they really wanted to spend a lot more time and money on outgrowers. Where were the outgrowers? Where's the suitability for tea? High quality tea. What's the road access infrastructure? What's the power? Can you get people in and out? Can you get the tea out? So this model, if you can look at it, shows about 120 points where slopes on roads exceeded 15 or 18% and crossed river points. So we were able to talk with the impact investors, say, look, here's the 120 bridges and road points you're going to need to fix if you want to generate the outgrower capability in those areas. So it helped us on the soils, and it helped us on a lot of the suitability indexing, but it also helped us identify what would be the cost to actually fix those things and bring that smallholder network in. He has to be at the factory within a couple hours of being picked. So there's not an awful lot of room. It also helped us identify where the fuel wood could be planted, because tea requires 75 kilograms per ton of wet tea. And you need to have forests. So forests, slopes, maybe we can put a few things together. So that was an interesting model we did for the natural capital project. Something even more interesting, and I'm getting now to, this is natural. These are all of the various layers that we've built into a new model that is being used, trying to get all of our specialists to basically go in and do fast screening, and I'll talk about where these are. But 2017 was a bumper year for forest fires, right? We have roughly $1 billion in forest industry, pulp, paper, and plantations. We had a client that lost 40,000 hectares of mature plantations in South Africa. We have a client in Mozambique that's trying to figure out how to make this start. And they had some pretty bad fires, luckily not mature forests. But if I swung over to Chile, you could begin to see, if you're using Aware, which is a really, really interesting piece of software that the bank is playing with now. Eric's lab is using this. And we're beginning to see some shifts that are actually quite extraordinary. We're seeing the onset of the rainy season in the southern hemisphere actually start to shift 2 to 3 weeks per year. Okay, not 1 year. We're beginning to see it consecutively. And that led to the 2017 enormous dry season that they had. And lo and behold, we had an atmospheric event. The La Nina came in, and they had humidity that no one had ever seen in many places, including Portugal, California, Chile, South Africa. And those were predictable events if you were watching carefully. And if you were in the forest business, you certainly want to know those things that were being set up. And some of this new meteorological instrumentation can actually help you begin to get onto it. So one thing we're doing now is using that same type of information and beginning to okay. Real-time weather information. We used to live with things called isoheights. Anybody know what an isoheight is? It's an imaginary line where you used to think it was between 2 different rainfall regimes, right? But now we can get real normalized weather information, and we can begin to actually say what it's really looked like for the last 15 years using a blended set of instruments from things I'm not sure I understand very well. But we can actually then go in and begin to calculate the anticipated size of the watershed, where the asparagus or horticulture, this is grapes, I think, where they are, and they get an idea of how much water they should be impounding if they anticipate being able to irrigate. And we have problems because we don't allow clients to just punch holes in until they drain the aquifers. So having an idea of how much water they need and what the impoundment area is critical, but you don't know that until you really have a good idea of what the stormwater runoff and rainfall is in the area and how much you can actually capture. So this is Aware. I sound like an Aware salesman. I am. I think they do some great stuff. We still haven't figured out a way to bring it to your fingertips or mine. But I think in the next year or two, we're going to see some fantastic things. Hang on. There's one little thing I wanted to show you how we're doing this. Yikes. Oh, let me get back there. May not. Sounds like Chris. I don't think I'm going to get there.
The fates are telling you it's time to stop.
Yeah, well, there's only one slide they wanted to see. You know, it was the last one. Get there. So this is the kind of what a portal looks like for risk assessment that we're developing. And right now, most of the tools that we're using for climate risk, you know, ones that have already been mentioned, natural hazards, think hazard, the portal, the World Bank's portal, obviously, and lots of other things that are being blended together. And what we're trying to do is make this available to specialists at their fingertips. And we're developing models for them. Nobody wants to play GIS all day except for me. And then we're trying to help them build a framework so that they can pull this stuff in so we can actually begin measuring adaptation risk on a real-time basis. So I'll finish it there.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Okay, so that concludes our presentations. We now have about 30 minutes for questions for those who can stay and ask questions. I will exercise my prerogative as moderator to start the questions off. We've obviously gotten a range of different perspectives and different details about how climate risk is being handled in different institutions. I would put it to all of the panelists, and whoever wants to answer, obviously may, you know, where do you see this going? We now have, in each case, we now have a few years behind us, other than the IFC, of experience. We have some, Becky pointing to some initial results. But where do you see this going in terms of addressing any major challenges that have been identified? And to the extent that we want to find out whether or not the risk assessments are actually useful in terms of improving sustainability of projects. I know there was some discussion of that in some of the presentations, but actually doing hard monitoring of adaptation interventions to see, at least in the near term, with respect to climate variability, whether they are performing as envisioned. Where do you see that going, or do you have plans to put monitoring systems in place? So the first question is about what are the major challenges, and then any downstream monitoring that may be planned. And I'll just open it to anyone who feels like answering either of those questions. Yeah.
So I see two main areas to move into more going forward. One is on the getting from the assessments to doing something about them. And I think, that has, as you can see, I think across the organizations there's a lot of focus on screening, but then what, right? And I think, in our process, the assessment has been supposed to be just the first part. There's also assessing and adaptively managing the risk, but it is the area that is the hardest to actually operationalize because there's so many different people doing it, so many different ways to make that real. And, so we're putting a lot of effort now into trying to improve that part of the process. And I think so related to that is building the awareness and some degree of capacity with people way beyond the climate realm, right? So I think that in order for this to be successful, the people working in food security, energy, health, all the different areas that our organizations work need to be able to get that these are things that they need to think about alongside all the other things that they have to think about, so that they can better design and implement these types of programs.
I can add quickly to that because I agree with what you just said, and from an operational point of view, I guess for us, if this becomes part of the core work of the team, and it's also part of their budget, right? So a transport project, they have a budget for their analysis of traffic, they have a budget for their EIA, etc. So they don't have money for this. So for now, we've been helping them a lot and to show both in design and implementation. And my colleague Dani can talk more about that concrete examples. Also, she's been looking at implementation. But in design, for example, we bring people that can help the construction companies they work with and show them, like, if they have hydrological analysis, you can incorporate this. Why don't you try this way of doing it? But it's, I think what's coming is really, for now we're at a stage of convincing one by one, and eventually this needs to become more part of the core project cycle. And I think we believe a lot in the design phase and the implementation also. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to add anything on that. Like you've been in, like we've been seeing two projects, right? That maybe they didn't look at this before in the project cycle, but they call us doing missions, right? And that's where kind of us having a link with the safeguard team has been useful for us because they go with teams on missions and they can find things like a landslide maybe in a road, which was in the case Dani was, and things like this, right? That slowly it's about building the trust also with the sector.
I think those are all true, but I think information is critical, and I think right now because it's not part of the traditional ESIA framework, but if ESIAs were done properly or differently, they'd be picking up this kind of information almost routinely. I don't believe the costs are really that high in identifying the risks, the adaptation, the structural, the engineering requirements will be significant, but that's just bringing them to the front. I think we've hidden for 20 years in climate and described it as climate change in the realm of IPCC and always in the carbon debate, and the fact is it's really hazards and it's down to operational issues. And I think that's our big challenge is if I can get to the point where I don't have to convince an investment officer that a hazard, a climate problem is not a climate issue, it's an operational issue, then they will begin to understand that they need to look a little bit harder at the insurance side, the continuity parts of it. And I think that's part of our language and how we integrate ourselves into the main work streams and how we get into workflows a bit more directly. So I think all of the organizations here have done that probably better than we have, but we've been operationalizing it in a different way. So this is very useful to read. Listening.
Maybe just to add to all the excellent comments, I think I would focus on three things that I think we're really pushing for. One is the need for indicators and the climate risk review. So how do we know we've done a good job at how? So the issue indicators, I think all the multilateral development banks and donors and bilaterals are really struggling with, but are really advancing the thinking. Okay, how can we measure that factor? What does it mean that we've done our, we elevated the aspect and the resilience of the project, but also thinking ahead, how can we contribute more to the overall climate change issues. The other one, you mentioned about resources, a lot of planning. This is a whole new aspect of thinking, so how do we really bring capacity, but it's capacity, resources in terms of people that can support and think and integrate, and then the financial side, right? How do we really enhance and enable this condition, this dialogue to happen? And the third one is climate information systems. I do want to pick on that aspect, but in terms of doing that, it's two things. We really need to start thinking more, what are the low-hanging fruits? It is about having more access to this, great access to maps and information, but there's two things on that. One is building the capacity of developing countries to be able to create those climate services, to be able to understand that with more information, maybe they can make better decisions. And I want to emphasize the maybe as well. Because there's two things. One is the short term, which I think is the sector, private sector, and the short term thinking. There's a lot that we need to do and gain, and we can do that. The issue is a bit when we start thinking about midterm and longer term. And this is the information that we still haven't been able to be experts in how we translate that information into impact, and what does it mean. You know, the future models and information, we know we have them, but what does it mean in terms of understanding uncertainty? How does it mean understanding that what it means is water, from energy, from health, and what does it mean to think about now, 20 years, and 50 years? So I think we still need to put all that to pieces in a puzzle.
All right, we'll open up to questions. All right, this mic is really low, so please speak loudly.
Okay. Hi, Peter Schultz. Thanks for the presentation. Just a quick thanks for putting together, I think, a really important panel. And my question relates to this. Can you describe any work that's happened in terms of kind of intercomparing the approaches that you've done? I mean, we've been involved in some of these. And I think these kinds of exchanges can be really valuable. And there have been compilations of sort of what's out there in terms of climate risk screening approaches. But a lot of times those compilations, they're not critical. They don't say, well, this is a strength of this, and really critically, this is a weakness of this approach. And what can we as a community learn for like version 2 and version 3? And you know, that each organization is kind of going through this internal evolutionary process. But I'm curious as to what's happening in terms of the sharing across institutions and that critical look at what can we learn from each other, what can we learn from ourselves.
Okay. So thanks, Peter. It's a really good question. I think I'll speak a little bit on our side, but I think I will take some with IDB, but it's a lot of discussion and the idea of sharing information. I think the big goal is each of our organizations have its own internal process, so we need to cater to the internal needs of the project cycle and how we perform our operations. But I think one particular aspect is the sharing of common data and common information and aspects. So I think at least on that side, we've been trying to develop a lot of climate profiles, share a lot of aspects in terms of what are the key risks that we identify. And I think we've been working very closely with the beautiful ladies here, and also with ISV, with RADO. But the issue of sharing common information, I think, is something, and how to reinterpret and how we start getting that into the thinking once that we do is a low-hanging fruit that I think is
Just briefly, there's an MDB group that we've informally met every now and then on this. It's been a while since we haven't met, so that's one avenue, and of course events like this. And we've met, you know, on climate information totally agree, and we've kind of had meetings because even a lot of institutions could share costs and everything on this. So that's an area as well.
I think there's an awful lot of information out there we're not using, any of us. And there's a whole world of private insurance, reinsurance that's out there, and they have models that far exceed what we're using right now, any of us. And it doesn't really find its way into the insurance systems that we generally use, that are determined by the country level. It doesn't find its way into the general country, but the insurance people have a pretty good idea when you're in Tornado Alley or in a hurricane or a flood zone or there's an awful lot of information there. It simply hasn't been gathered and organized yet. So we do things around here. I mean, we don't want to talk about the 1,000-year events they had up in Ellicott City. Again, doing two years in a row, 1,000-year event. I think the insurance companies know more.
All right. I might take a couple from the room, and then you can kind of choose which to answer.
Thank you. Neil Warder. My question is, are you mapping this data with population demographic data? For example, we have these events, but these events impact on people. And for example, we see in the Sahel increased conflict between herders who can no longer find pasture. They move into areas where there are people who have farms, and we're seeing that mixed with some of the, for lack of a better term, jihadi events, etc. So how are you using this climate change mapping to look at the impact on people vis-a-vis demographic shifts and project vis-a-vis for governments and other partners? What are we going to do when the population of Bamako doubles, to 3 million, and the population of Wagga doubles in 10 years?
I'll take one more from the room.
Sorry. This is for Dave, ISD. You mentioned that there were some internal calculating of projects that the ISD deemed as mitigating climate risk. And I was curious, what an example of some of those projects would be, and if that's the program they're trying to expand, or if that data would ever become public.
Any other burning questions? And then
Fred Lepschultz, USCCRP. So a lot of these, you've been talking about your internal processes, but it's really to aid the program officers who are actually giving the loans. So when someone comes in and says, well, to mitigate the risk, I need 10% more, or loans can be 20% more, how are you seeing your information actually affecting the loan and the loan amounts to actually cope with the extra risk that you've identified in your screening? And then I think that's part of the monitoring evaluation question, that if it's a 10% plus or 5% plus on what you would have done anyway, how do we start capturing that and understanding that this is really costing people real money, and to feed that back into negotiations and other things that are going on?
all right, I'll leave it open to the panel. Address those three.
Those are really good questions, so thanks for that, and I really appreciate also that question on conflict and the kind of demographic part, because I would acknowledge that for now that's an area we need to work a lot on, right? For example, the IDB finances a lot of infrastructure, and the approach has been very structural. So I would say everything that has to do with more ecosystemic issues, we need to strengthen the methodology on that. And also the social side. Of course, it's not to say that it hasn't been done. For example, I like that about a project we worked actually with Hope in Haiti. And there was a market there. And the losses there, for example, of the women working there, I mean, it's probably not a lot when you quantify it, but it's a lot per day for those people, what they kind of lose for a day of not work, that the market is closed for the flooding, right? So I think we need to do more on the mapping and the strategic side, but we are definitely trying to see ways in which costs don't drive everything, right? It's also the impact to the population affected. So definitely take that as a thing to work on. And on the internal processes, definitely, I mean, this is a question for us, and that's why it's so important to classify projects. Not everything can be high risk for us now, because we need to start somewhere. And for the high risk projects, what we are kind of telling our management is some projects will need more time in the preparation process and more money. So we need to be more careful to see which projects we fight for that. And I think eventually that's what will happen. Some projects will just need more time. And the kind of having a monitoring system is key. And something I wanted to say that, and definitely that's an area of expertise of my colleague Daniela, but that's why sometimes in projects risk assessment is so important, because you talk about avoided costs, right? And so you can monetize that. If you put those measures, then yes, they're going to have a cost, but the cost of not doing that is higher, right? So, yeah.
Let's see, the demographic piece, I think we're including it right now. I don't need to wait 20 years to see Bamako double in size. I know it's going to happen, but we do look at demographics. Some of those models I was showing were in weather. We put the weather on top of the demographic pressure, and I can show you a conflict map from yesterday. And I can't tell you that was caused by a pocket drought or this, that, or another, but you can begin to map the coincidence of those things if you have the information in the right format. So I think climate-related conflict is certainly not a new concept for us, but it's changing and it's morphing and it's happening very quickly with urbanization. So since we're so granular in what we do and an investment is so localized, most of the colleagues are talking about larger programmatic investments that may be for a department or a province or a national level. We're operating at a much finer scale. So we need to look at those things because they impact us fairly directly. So I think that's part of the answer. On examples, what do we pick up and what do we account? If we're doing a forestry project and it's increasing carbon sequestration, we'll pick it up. If it's a degraded land and it now produces 200 cubic meters a year, we will pick up that part of that difference. If it's a hotel chain and they're putting in above what they could have bought for their HVAC system, they're putting in something that's better efficiency, or maybe their laundry facilities better, we will pick up some of that change, and we have a tool that we look at to help construction, physical buildings, physical infrastructure do that and try to account for where the benefits would be. So we kind of just grab that and we carry it, and we're trying to figure out how much interest there is in it and how we can better market it. I think that maybe goes to the last question, is why do you care? Why do you worry? How do you account for it, the monitoring aspect? I think one of the differences here is that the assessment of carbon or social risks or environmental risks are if they're just yours, if they're just the banks, the MDBs, they're not the clients, then we take on an awful lot of additional responsibility. So the assessment function has to be a continual assessment function. And that's what we really look for. All the performance standards stuff aside, it's that PS1 continuous assessment. And going every year we go through and we say, okay, how much health and safety change have you had? What's kept you awake at night? Have you done an emergency evacuation plan for hurricanes? We know there's earthquakes, and we know there's general flooding, but you've never put an evacuation plan for that particular climate risk. So it gets better as we stay involved in it, and I think it begins to be self-convincing when they begin to realize that it's part of the business continuity. They don't stop asking us questions, they start thinking about it themselves, and I think that's part of how we add value, I think.
So on the demographics, I think that's one of the big challenges. We at USAID really try to encourage people to think about how climate interacts with other stressors, so that all these things work together, and you can't think about these things in an isolated way. But that's not an easy thing to do. And if you incorporate all of the different things that could possibly feed into this into a tool, for example, what will that tool look like? And so that's a big challenge, and I think that's also where part of our approach is really about just trying to get people to think better about these things and not necessarily rely on entering things into a box and then seeing what gets spit out of the box at the end. But it is a real challenge, and at USAID we do a lot of different assessments on a lot of issues like that. I mean, the demographic issue is just one of them. And so how do you also think about the interplay between those different issues when you're doing one assessment at a time, which is often what happens? And it also relates to my previous comment, how do you make sure that assessments actually become a reality and are not just documents that some expert did and then are sitting there, right? So all of those things feed together, and it is a big challenge. On the resources, I would just, we don't have numbers for you on that, but I would just say, this is why doing the engaging in climate risk management early is really important, because the whole point is for it to inform what the project looks like. So by the time you release the project, you should know what kinds of things are supposed to be incorporated in that and what the costs are, so that whoever implementing it is able to do the things that are in there. And people mentioned earlier the challenge of kind of knowing when to start. But I think the answer is that in some ways it does have to be iterative, because and this is also where it gets difficult to measure too, right? Because you can't, in our process, it's not like you start with something and then you go through some kind of tool and then you come out with something else and you can measure what the difference is, right? You're going through a thoughtful process, and at the end you come up with a good design, hopefully. And it's not necessarily easy to say, oh, because we thought about this one climate thing, we did this thing differently, right? And so how you measure what the result of applying climate risk management is, if it's a natural, inherent part of your process, which is what our goal is.
I think I'll just add everything that is said. We do from the World Bank, right? I think it's just right in that sense. In population, climate is considered as USAID and the IDB is a development issue. So it's one layer of that component. I just want to mention a report that was done really quickly, and one of my colleagues here is the co-author. It's called Groundswell. It's on climate change and migration. And it's exactly that. It's understanding the possibilities of what does it mean internally, migration internally in the country. It's the use of models, they use a lot of socioeconomic, a lot of population mapping, and where the hotspots of internal migration could occur. I think we have data, and Vivian here could explain more about, but it's about global data, but also in 3 countries where we did the pilot. It's more about 100 million people mobilized due to climate change in different aspects internal. So what that translates into planning for urban, for hotspots, for migration and migration, what do we do different to prepare that? These are the things that, yes, we definitely are. It's a main must to start thinking about that. In terms of finance, pretty much is everything that we said. It's how we integrate climate, the cost thinking, what are the avoided damages and losses that we can integrate, but it's starting early. And so how the climate finance discussion can really be integrated in the country, how to start doing that planning, what's going to cost you more now than before to do that exercise, but it's really thinking about maybe what are the options to really de-risk some of these options now so we can still attract investments, so insurances and things like that as IFC, but it's putting the numbers on top for the discussion, as my colleagues mentioned.
Okay, we're wrapping up. Okay, I just want to make a plug for the Groundswell report too on Atlas. We're using it to frame one of our activities that is looking at the drivers for migration, conflict, and things. It's a great report, so thank you all for that. Yeah. Okay, so we had a great discussion. I know that the presentations were short, but hopefully everyone got at least a taste of what's being done at the different institutions and what's going on in the climate risk assessment space more generally. And all of this, everything as it says here, will be up on Climate Links in the next week or so. So you can look for it there. And, I think this is a topic that we'll probably end up wanting to continue the conversation going forward. So look out for other events and resources. So thanks, everyone. Thanks again to our panel.
Thank you.
I know. Yeah, somebody needs to like. We can take a look at it. Exactly. At least at easy group. Okay, I can.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah,
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I think so.